I'd like to say a few words about the epistles of Paul. I'm talking about the book of Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and so forth, which were written to various congregations in the church as well as certain individuals. About half of these books are accepted by virtually every New Testament historian to have been genuinely written by Paul, and they say that based on analysis of the textual content, on how well they corroborate history, and various other standard historical criteria. I personally accept the authorship of all these books as having been written by Paul, which is consistent with what the early church believed. However, in more recent times, various historians have come to reject the authorship of, or at the very least question the authorship of some of these books. In particular, the more liberal scholars dispute that Paul wrote the book of Ephesians, 1 Timothy, and 2 Timothy, as well as Titus. And they're about evenly divided about whether he wrote the letter to the Colossians or 2 Thessalonians. I want to talk about some of those arguments and why I don't think they hold water. We won't have time to cover every single one of them, but I want to just give some examples why I think that the arguments offered against their authorship is somewhat, is more than a little tenuous. Now, just to head off any dispute, I know that some people will say, wait a minute, you haven't covered all of the arguments yet. There's still other reasons why we should reject their authorship. I agree. And if time allows, I'd love to present a more thorough set of videos discussing this. I don't know when that will happen, though. I have hard enough time keep producing videos as it is. Some of you have noted a very large gap, several months between some of these videos. I just want to provide a sampling for now and hopefully inspire people to do a little more careful thinking about some of these arguments in the future. Let's cite a few examples here. For example, let's see. The book of Ephesians. A lot of scholars dismiss the notion that Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesians, and among other reasons, they cite Ephesians chapter 1, verse 15, wherein the author says, "Therefore I also, after I heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all the saints," the phrase in which suggests that the author merely heard of the Ephesians' love for Jesus and love for the people within the church, and they say, you know, it sounds like this person didn't actually hear about these things on a first-hand basis. He heard about them through secondary sources. But Paul, we know, ministered in church in Ephesus. In fact, he helped found the Ephesian church, according to Acts 19. So they say, therefore, we must conclude that Paul was not the author of this text. I think that's faulty reasoning, and here's why. Just because he founded the church doesn't mean that he was personally privy to every single thing that happened there. If you're the pastor of a church, even in modern times, you're not going to know everything about every single person who attends your church. Some of the information you're going to hear will be secondhand stories of how people sacrifice, secondhand stories of how people love, of good deeds they performed, of how deeply they're studying the Word, and so forth. So the notion that Paul heard some of this information about the Ephesian church on a secondhand basis is not a good argument against his having written the book of Ephesians. That's a sort of critique, that's the sort of argument I'd expect to hear from someone who had never been intimately involved in a church at all. Anyone who's had any sort of serious involvement with a local church nowadays should know that the pastor can only do so much and can only experience so much firsthand. In fact, that's true of just about any gathering. If you work for a company, you're not going to personally know about every single good thing that your coworkers have done. A lot of the information you're going to hear will be secondhand. Some from reliable sources, some not so reliable perhaps, but secondhand nonetheless. So this is not a good argument against his having written the book of Ephesians. Let's talk about the pastoral epistles. In other words, his epistles to 1 and 2 Timothy and the letter to Titus. Some liberal scholars dispute that he wrote these letters because they say, you know, he used a different vocabulary, different writing style from when he was writing to the churches. I don't think that's a good argument either, and here's why. If you're writing to a general congregation, it stands to reason that you'd probably use a different writing style than when you're writing to a close personal friend, or even just an individual of your personal acquaintance. The purpose of your writing will be different. You're probably going to use a more casual style. This strikes me as a very weak argument against his having written 1 and 2 Timothy or Titus. I'm not saying this. I'm not saying that my counter argument proves he wrote them. I think we have other good reason to believe that, such as the testimony of the early church, who were much closer to those events chronologically. I'm just saying that the argument against his authorship of those epistles is very weak, to say the least. One more example here. The letter to Colossians. Again, one criticism voiced is that the vocabulary he used in Colossians doesn't match that of his other writings. I don't think that's a good argument either. For one thing, people's writing styles can evolve with time. They can differ, especially as you gain more experience with writing. They can vary depending on what you're trying to say, on the theme you're trying to deal with. If you had somebody proofreading the document, that might also help. And there's good reason to believe that he had perhaps Silas helping with some of the writing. One of the criticisms is that he writes with a supposedly liturgical hymnic style that doesn't appear in any of his other works. Let's consider the following example. Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. Here he writes with what seems to be a somewhat stilted style. He says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross." He speaks in this sort of highfalutin style with some repetition, kind of repeating certain themes over and over again in a very rhythmic manner. And it does sound kind of stilted. And some would say, therefore, see, he's writing with a very different style than he does in the other passages, in the other letters. I don't think that's a serious objection either. And here's why. Suppose you were talking to someone on the telephone, say a loved one, and you were to start saying, "You fill up my senses like a night in the forest, like the mountains in springtime, like a walk in the rain, like a storm in the desert, like the sleepy blue ocean. You fill up my senses, come fill me again." Someone listening might think that's very stilted language, that you're speaking in a very strange manner, unless they understood that you were quoting John Denver in Annie's song. Those of you who grew up in the 70s have some idea what I'm talking about, I hope. Those of you who are unfamiliar with this music would probably think that such language sounded weird, sounded strange. The bottom line is, it could very well be that Paul was quoting some hymns of the time, music, perhaps even a creed. So the mere fact that he used somewhat stilted language in that case doesn't argue, it's not a good argument against his having written the book of Colossians. As far as I'm concerned, the testimony of history is, or rather the testimony of people who are much closer to that period chronologically, is stronger evidence than any sort of oblique analysis of the language used in that passage. As I said, we don't have time to cover all the arguments offered against the authorship of the Pauline epistles. In brief, what I want to emphasize is that these arguments really are not compelling, that are kind of sloppy, and to my mind, not at all convincing.